Nicole Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
We've been through a lot together.
We've got a timeline for it now, and the time it's now.
Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban spent nearly 2 decades carefully constructing one of the most admired and romanticized love stories in the entire entertainment world. A tale built on redemption and resilience that fans across the globe invested in deeply and sincerely, and yet behind every red carpet appearance, every tearful award show dedication, and every carefully worded interview about the strength of their bond, something was quietly and persistently coming apart at the seams until the day it finally could not be held together any longer. Nicole Mary Kidman came into the world in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1967, born to Australian parents who were temporarily living abroad. Her father Anthony, a clinical psychologist and biochemist, and her mother Janelle, a nurse and educator. And when she was still a small child, the family returned to Sydney, where she grew up in a household shaped by discipline and ambition, but also by a shyness so intense that her teachers genuinely worried about her confidence, watching her blush deeply whenever she was asked to speak in class, a timidity that existed in strange and productive tension with an equally powerful imagination that eventually drove her toward ballet, then drama classes, then youth theater groups, where she discovered she could channel through performance the emotions she struggled to express in ordinary life. Her talent became undeniable during her teenage years as Australia's film industry was blossoming around her, and she moved quickly from television movies to the 1983 cult thriller BMX Bandits, her porcelain features and striking height making her visually memorable, while her emotional range convinced directors that she was built for something larger. And by the late 1980s, Hollywood had come calling, and she answered. It was during that ascending period that she met Tom Cruise, married him in 1990, and entered a union that brought enormous prestige alongside considerable pain, because Scientology cast a long and heavy shadow over their years together. And when the marriage ended in 2001, she lost not only a husband but also primary custody of their 2 adopted children, Isabella and Connor, a wound that friends described as cutting to the very core of her because it felt like being stripped of motherhood itself, reduced to the edges of her own children's lives. And for a woman who longed with genuine and aching depth for a family of her own, that rupture became one of the defining traumas of everything that followed. Keith Lionel Urban was born across the Tasman Sea in Whangarei, New Zealand, the same year as Nicole, his family relocating to Queensland, Australia, while he was still young, and bringing him into a home life marked by tension and financial strain that gave his restless and rebellious personality nowhere comfortable to settle. Though his father's passion for country music opened one genuine door, because by the age of 6 the young Keith was already performing, finding in that genre of heartbreak and redemption both an identity and a form of therapy that nothing else in his life could provide. He dropped out of school to pursue music full-time because for him there was simply no plan B and no alternative that felt worth considering. Performing in talent shows and small bars through his teenage years and cultivating not just his sound but the image of a brooding country outsider with a rock star's edge. But alongside the prodigious musical talent came demons that announced themselves early and stayed long, because by his 20s he was already struggling with alcohol and substance use, and fame, when it finally arrived, did not steady him but instead amplified the chaos. His breakthrough coming in 1999 with his self-titled American debut album, which made him country music's new heartthrob, even as his success was being quietly undermined by self-destruction. By the time he met Nicole in 2005, he had already been in and out of rehab and lived with the constant fear that his addictions might eventually cost him everything he had worked so hard to build. When their paths crossed at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles in January 2005, a celebration of Australians working in Hollywood, both of them were standing at turning points that in retrospect seem almost engineered for collision. Nicole having rebuilt her career powerfully after her divorce and won an Academy Award for The Hours while remaining emotionally raw and hungry for stability. Keith, a rising star in the hyper-competitive world of American country music but being pushed toward the edge by everything the industry demanded of him. She later admitted she did not think he was interested at first because he was polite but reserved, and though they exchanged numbers he did not call her for months. And she confessed that his initial lack of approach nearly ended the story before it began. But when he finally reached out, something clicked between them and their romance moved quickly, photographs appearing by May, and by the end of that year she was describing him in interviews as the man who had swept her off her feet, telling anyone who asked that he represented a freedom and rawness and unpolished passion that she had never known in her previous marriage. For him, she represented legitimacy, elegance, and the kind of stabilizing force he had never found anywhere else. And in June 2006, just over a year after they began dating, they married in a lavish ceremony at the Cardinal Soretti Memorial Chapel on Sydney's Manly Peninsula, she in a Balenciaga gown with a dramatic veil and he with his trademark long hair looking every bit the romantic troubadour the press had always made him out to be. The guest list glittering with Hollywood royalty and country music stars, while Nicole reportedly walked into the church by candlelight holding back tears as he serenaded her during the reception. And the world watching from the outside saw exactly the picture-perfect ending to two troubled pasts that it wanted to see. Reality arrived within 4 months. Keith checked himself into rehab for alcohol abuse before Nicole had barely finished writing her wedding thank you cards. A devastating blow to their newlywed life that the tabloids seized upon immediately, suggesting she had married a time bomb. While she chose loyalty over embarrassment, stood by him, visited him in rehab, and refused to give the press the satisfaction of seeing her falter, throwing herself into the role of healer and protector with an intensity that insiders recognized as coming at least partly from the fact that she had been denied the chance to save her marriage with Tom and was now determined not to fail again. He credited her in later interviews with saving his life during that period, and that pattern of her as anchor and him as the one being anchored settled into the architecture of their marriage and stayed there, sometimes as a source of genuine strength and sometimes as a source of growing resentment on both sides. Despite that shaky beginning, the couple spent the years that followed crafting their public image with considerable skill and consistency, she continuing to take on major film roles while he solidified his position as one of country music's biggest stars and won multiple Grammy Awards. Their schedules demanding long separations that they tried to manage with rules about never spending more than a few weeks apart, though insiders reported those rules were frequently broken by the relentless demands of two enormous careers pulling in opposite directions. When their first daughter Sunday Rose arrived in 2008 and their second daughter Faith Margaret in 2010, Nicole poured herself into motherhood with the fierce and protective energy of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to lose access to her children. And though Keith adored his daughters, he struggled with the balance between fatherhood and the restless touring life that defined his professional identity. And that difference in approach to parenting became one of the quieter but more persistent fault lines running beneath the surface of everything they presented to the world. The public narrative remained stubbornly intact through all of it because they were not simply a married couple but the embodiment of a particular kind of hope, the idea that love could survive addiction and distance and the crushing pressure of fame, and every photograph and every red carpet gesture and every tearful award show speech became another brick in the mythology they were building together, a mythology that became increasingly difficult to maintain and increasingly at odds with what was actually happening in private. Friends close to the couple described her as growing progressively more weary of carrying the emotional weight of his struggles, and while she admired his artistry, she worried about his mental balance and his ongoing relationship with sobriety, while he reportedly bristled at being perpetually cast as the one who needed rescuing and wanted to be her equal rather than her project. The tension between those two positions never fully resolving itself no matter how many years passed or how many times they publicly insisted they had never been stronger. As the 2020s arrived, the tabloid whispers grew louder and harder to dismiss, stories surfacing about arguments and time spent apart and Keith being spotted on tour without his wedding ring while Nicole began attending events alone. And though both continued to deny the speculation, their denials began to carry the quality of lines being recited rather than truths being declared, their public affection looking increasingly like a performance staged as much for themselves as for the cameras. Those closest to them described a dynamic in which she had grown tired of always being the anchor, longing for a marriage in which she was not constantly bracing for the next storm, while he had grown weary of the weight of her expectations and the feeling of being monitored and managed even in his better moments. Two people whose needs had gradually moved so far out of alignment that the distance between them could no longer be papered over with red carpet appearances and carefully worded interviews. The tipping point came in the summer of 2025 when the slow acknowledgement that they were no longer sustaining each other finally became impossible to ignore or deny, and when Nicole filed for divorce in late September 2025 in Davidson County, Tennessee, citing irreconcilable differences, those who had been watching closely felt not so much shock as the particular sad recognition of an ending that had been a long time coming. The filing was restrained in its language, straightforward in its legal details, both parties waiving spousal and child support in a sign that their finances had long been managed separately. but Nicole seeking primary residential custody of Sunday and Faith while Keith retained joint decision-making authority. Her determination shaped directly by the memory of losing access to Isabella and Connor, and her absolute refusal to let history repeat itself. Keith's response came not through legal documents but through performance, because just days after the divorce news broke, he appeared on stage in Pennsylvania for his High and Alive World Tour without his wedding ring. And during the show he altered lyrics in 2 of his signature songs in ways that nobody in the audience missed, transforming a line in his 2004 breakup anthem You'll Think of Me from its original wording into the pointed phrase, "Take your unreasonable reasons." A lyric twist that landed with the sharp clarity of something directed at a specific person, spat out with a frustration that stood in direct and jarring contrast to the slideshow of images featuring him and his daughters that played during Heart Like a Hometown, a strange simultaneous gesture of anger and tenderness that captured the impossible complexity of where he was emotionally. He dropped The Fighter entirely from his setlist, a 2016 hit widely understood to have been inspired by his relationship with Nicole and long performed with her in mind, and that deliberate erasure of a song connected to her felt like its own kind of statement about what he was trying to leave behind, while speculation about his rumored closeness with younger guitarist Maggie Baugh hovered over the entire evening and amplified every choice he made on stage that night. The absence of any mention of Nicole combined with the pointed lyric changes and the missing ring producing a performance that felt less like a concert and more like a public reckoning conducted in real time in front of thousands of people. The divorce filings and that dramatic concert appearance together transformed the media landscape around them instantly, tabloids framing Nicole as the woman who had finally had enough and Keith as the tragic figure undone by his own demons, fans dissecting every lyric and every public appearance for clues about who bore more responsibility for the collapse of something so many people had believed in so completely. Nicole responded not with words but with the careful and composed management of her public presence, appearing at a film festival weeks after the filing without her wedding ring. Her poise outwardly intact but her eyes carrying a sadness that was difficult to look at directly, retreating in the weeks that followed into the sanctuary of her daughters and her work, photographed walking hand in hand with Sunday and Faith in Nashville with a body language that was simultaneously composed and fiercely protective. Keith poured himself into his music with an intensity that fans described as heartbreak made visible, his concerts becoming electric and emotionally raw spectacles in which he openly wept during certain songs and spoke candidly between them about his childhood and the passion that had driven him long before fame and marriage and everything that had since unraveled. His vulnerability endearing him to audiences even as it illustrated something of the reality that Nicole had ultimately decided she could no longer live inside. What their story leaves behind is not simply the wreckage of a marriage but the portrait of 2 genuinely wounded people who found in each other the reflection of everything they needed and everything they feared, who built something real out of shared pain and genuine love, and then watched it buckle under the weight of needs that were never quite compatible. A relationship that lasted nearly 20 years because both of them wanted it to work and finally ended because wanting was no longer enough to make it so.